Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. Today we're going to continue our book club series by discussing a book that is normally something that would be outside of our wheelhouse. And that is Endurance, Shackleton's Incredible Voyage to the Antarctic by Alfred Lansing. Just as a bit of an admin note, I'm kind of away from my desk at the moment, so we'll have to deal with an audio-only version for this time. And this book is sort of out of the theme of things that we would normally talk about here, but that's a good thing, because one, I'm glad that we actually had a nice quiet read for the holiday season this time around, and it's good to get a perspective on things like leadership and persevering in times of adversity that I think is a really good way to start the new year off right. And what better way to do that than talking about the ultimate fateful voyage, Shackleton's expedition to the Antarctic. So for those of you who are unaware of Shackleton's fateful voyage to the Antarctic, this is the epitome of survival stories. This is an incredible tale of perseverance, even when all hope has been lost. Just as a very brief overview for those of you who are not aware of the story, the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition of 1914 was Sir Ernest Shackleton's attempt to cross the Antarctic continent. That was the original goal. However, the story became much more well known for what happened afterwards, as his ship, the Endurance, immediately became beset in ice and eventually was crushed and sank. Over a period of hundreds of days, the crew eventually had to abandon ship and spend many months trapped on several ice floes as they attempted to make their way towards any form of civilization. After spending many months with no hope of being rescued or trapped on several ice floes, they were able to launch their lifeboats and reach Elephant Island. Once they reached Elephant Island, they were certainly not saved yet, as the island was uninhabited and they still had an 800-mile journey ahead of them, which Shackleton undertook with a few of his crewmen to the island of South Georgia. But wait, we're not done yet. Once Shackleton and his advance party were able to land on South Georgia, they then had to scale and climb extremely tall mountains that no one had ever climbed before in order to reach a whaling station, which was eventually their source of rescue. After almost 500 days, Shackleton finally made contact with a whaling station. Shackleton was able to send ships back to rescue the rest of his crew on Elephant Island. Miraculously, throughout this entire story, not a single member of the crew was lost. Everyone survived, in a situation which would have killed probably most of the crew had they not possessed extreme qualities, which is why this story is an incredible testament to the strength of the human spirit, really, and the will to survive against all odds. Now obviously, Shackleton's story has been told and retold hundreds of times in the centuries since the disaster occurred, so I can't really add too much to it from that perspective, and if you would like to go down the rabbit hole of learning about Antarctic expedition and some of the burly characters involved in that era of the golden age of exploration, you can certainly do that. Today I thought I would look at this story through the lens, as always, of the prepared citizenry, and see what lessons we can learn from an Antarctic expedition that took place over 100 years ago. Speaking of the actual book itself, Alfred Lansing's 1956 book on Shackleton's voyage is probably the most well-known contemporary retelling of the tale. Like I mentioned in my notes here, this is a great book for young adults, or for adding to, say, like a homeschool curriculum, because there's no profanity, there's no vulgarity, and any sort of sailorly language is really only talked about in abstract. Really, the only part of the story that, for me, was quite unfortunate was how the crew had to kill their dog sled teams, both for food and because they didn't want them to suffer because they couldn't feed them. So that is quite the unfortunate part of the story. But other than that, this book would be, I think, quite good for a lot of young adults who are looking for a little bit of exploration reading. So moving right on to the lessons learned from this book, at least from the perspective that I'm trying to come at this from, one of the main things that you kind of get early on is that thinking strategically, to be able to anticipate problems weeks or even months in advance is really a valuable skill that Shackleton gained through his experience, and it's something that's really hard to quantify. But it's not just him, and that leads into the second point, which is that Shackleton kind of gets all of the credit because he was obviously the leader of this expedition, and he undoubtedly possessed great leadership efforts and prowess. But that is not really all on his shoulders. He also had a great team behind him, for the most part. He had a great second-in-command, he had a great first officer, he had a really good team that was willing to be led, again, for the most part. Like I mentioned, Shackleton had a really great team, but some people on the team possessed some qualities that perhaps were not ideal. Though I'm sure at the time this sort of thing was not really okay to talk about openly, but I'm really glad that this actually is a good part of the story, because it definitely shows how timeless some of this is. What I mean by this is that sometimes when we're trying to learn stuff from history, we fall prey to, again, the over-romanticized version of the godlike hero, right? And though the phrase, history is told or written by the victor, is a common phrase, I would argue that history is a lot of times written by the losers, because the losers have an awful lot of free time on their hands and nobody's really paying attention. So a lot of times what you'll get is a story of a real historical incident that is completely devoid of any negativity, of any negative personality traits. Everyone's perfect in every way. You get this a lot with the history of warfare, right? Especially with like generals and military leaders of some kind. Lansing, in this book, of course having access to diaries and really trying to get to the bottom of the story, was able to really convey several personalities that didn't really quite work so well. We all like to imagine that Shackleton's crew was just one gigantic, fantastic team of people who got together at all times, and that certainly wasn't the case. As a matter of fact, Shackleton himself really did remember some of the bad behavior that was undertaken by a couple of the crewmen. For instance, there were a couple of people who were just extremely narcissistic, work shy, they were lazy, even during a time where, their ship, their lifeboats were about to sink. He still had problems with people not wanting to do their share of the work, which the fact that these people were able to actually work through these problems at the time is just astounding, because I can't imagine doing that. But again, these moments where we sort of see the narcissism of some characters, the selfishness of some characters, and the laziness of some characters during a time where literally their lives depend on their efforts. This makes the whole idea of these negative personality traits really being timeless. At some point in our lives, all of us will have worked with an annoying coworker, right? But the fact that these guys, not just Shackleton, but a lot of the other crew, were able to actually get these people to be productive members of the crew, and were able to keep pushing forward after hundreds of days, is just remarkable, right? And you don't really get that feeling from the book of how they were able to do this, other than the fact that they possessed very, very interesting qualities of being able to read personality traits, which leads to the next point, which is that a lot of times leadership is sometimes solely about keeping people from killing each other, and to a larger degree, babysitting the troublemakers. This is very commonly mentioned in the book. It's almost like every chapter Shackleton is keeping the troublemakers around him, making them sleep in his tent or being put on, in his boat, because he wanted to keep them under a close eye. Not so much because they were work shy a lot of times, but because they could potentially sow dissent with the rest of the crew, and he didn't want that whatsoever. Shackleton was very, very attentive to this, and this is one of the reasons why he's touted as such a great leader, is because he was able to determine very easily and very quickly what people were thinking and the moods that they had. A lot of the times, men were chosen for certain tasks, not because they were the most capable or best crewmen for the job, but because Shackleton wanted to personally keep an eye on them. And this is because Shackleton realized that morale and dissent will kill a team faster than anything else. Though it's not explicitly stated in the book, you really get the idea that Shackleton's biggest concerns and his biggest adversaries and his biggest enemies throughout this entire crisis were not the cold, were not the wind, were not the ice. No, his biggest problems were morale. Shackleton spent most of his time distracting people from the situation that they were in. And this is where we get a lot of the doctrine from regarding survival tactics, right? What do they tell you when you're in a situation where you can't really escape, like you're lost in the woods or adrift at sea or something like that? What's the number one thing? Stay busy. Don't just sleep all day, keep to a schedule, make sure that you're actually putting your efforts to good use, because that will keep you from getting complacent. complacency will kill a team and will kill a person's will to survive very, very quickly. Shackleton pioneered that over 100 years ago, which is just remarkable. And he really had to be honest, because let's face it, the environment that this crew was trapped in was tremendous. And this is kind of another one of those lessons that is really just kind of a departure from what you might think, which is that the idea of cold, just absolutely blisteringly cold conditions, these are really tremendous forces that we almost always underestimate, especially in our modern times, right? Reading through this book in sort of a passive way really sets you to thinking about how hypothermia and other cold injuries will really kill you quite quickly. In some cases quite slowly, but in many cases hypothermia and other cold-related injuries are a major killer. Just thinking back for me, at least, when I lived in the Pacific Northwest, being born and raised in the American Southeast, for me, cold was, something that was anything less than 50 degrees was kind of chilly. But when I spent several years up in the Pacific Northwest, man, it's indescribable. And guys in the military know what I'm talking about, because a lot of times you'll have people that are in the military that are born and raised in, the American South or the Southwest, where it's, pretty hot most of the year, and they're just not used to cold temperatures. But it's more than just cold. It's the high humidity that's the problem. When I was doing some search and rescue work up in the Pacific Northwest, I really, when I first started, thought it was kind of odd that most of the time people would focus more on hypothermia than anything else. Like, if you look at the contents of the gear that people would bring for like a rescue mission, it would be mostly things that would be preventative of cold. Multiple isomats, sleep mats, multiple blankets, tarps, shelters, all kinds of stuff. And we would take this stuff out even when the temperatures were barely below 50 or 60 degrees, And that's because if you're laying on the ground and you're in a damp environment over a period of hours and hours and sometimes days, you are going to die from hypothermia, because you will be chilled to the bone. It's crazy, because I've spent time in some really cold places where, the ground is just frozen for a lot of the year. But man, during my years in the Pacific Northwest, I don't think I ever was as cold as I was then, even though the temperatures rarely dipped below freezing, unless you're going up in altitude. Most of the time down in the valleys, the temperature year-round didn't really get below freezing, kind of hovered at maybe 40 degrees, maybe upper 30s for a lot of the winter. But man, I was never as cold in my life as during that time, because the humidity is so high. So you get the kind of idea that from this book, cold is just something that's really hard to describe unless you're able to experience it yourself. This book, to me, just every page, I just kept reinforcing my own idea of why I carry, during the wintertime, even in the Southeast here, I carry a lot of hypothermia preventing gear, stuff that people probably would not carry otherwise. So that's just kind of an interesting side note, at least for me personally. But one of the major lessons learned, at least for me, in the context of what we're really trying to prepare for as we move forward into 2024, is that some disasters take months. It's really hard to kind of put into words and to understand that a lot of times some disasters are going to take a very, very long time to recover from. I think that in the prepping and preparedness world, we kind of get stuck into a couple of different camps, right? We get stuck into those, which, I think prior to 2019 was probably a minority of people, which think that the lights are going to go out and they're going to stay out forever, right? We're going to have some kind of EMP or nuclear war or something like that, and we get to live out our own, post-apocalyptic fantasies that way. The other side of things is that people want to prepare for the 3-day emergencies that are not going to last for more than 3 days, right? And there's, of course, some crossover between the two, and we can talk a lot about, risk assessment and things like that. But by and large, it's really hard to kind of get through your head that sometimes, for some emergencies, it's really going to take many, many months to recover from. And when I mean emergencies, I really don't mean getting trapped on an ice floe for years, right? I mean things like losing your job, right? In today's economy, losing your job is not really a good thing. It's not something that's easily recoverable from, especially in depending on what your profession is. That can be just as devastating as some of the more obscure things we may prepare for, right? But we don't prepare for losing our job a lot of times. A lot of us, prepare for things like, being able to produce water, water purification and filtration and stuff like that. It's very common. Everybody's got water tablets in their pockets these days. Everybody's got a filter in their backpack or something like that. But how many people are prepared for not being able to buy hamburger at the grocery store because it's been too expensive for the past 9 months for anyone to afford? And the meat that you're able to buy at the grocery store is already rotten because nobody's willing to buy it because it's too expensive. How do you prepare for something like that? That is a months-long crisis, and it's really hard to kind of put into words some of the modern problems that we might face. And to be honest, even in a time where hopelessness is a mainstream idea now, I really, reading this book, get a sense of hope, to be honest, because I went full circle with this story. Shackleton's Voyage is kind of the epitome of the successful failure, right? You really look back at this book and you think, all right, none of this stuff is really complicated. What did Shackleton do? The guy who was, suicidal, he put him on cooking duty and told him to put his talents to good use and start making some food. For the guy who was a little bit narcissistic, he was able to play up to his grand intellect, right, and get him to do things that other people weren't able to do. He kept people busy during times of crisis. He was a decisive leader. He was in command. He was every bit of all of these leadership manuals and self-help books that we read. And if you look at that, and if you read the book, I'm sure many of you would say, this is not that impressive. Like, this guy just did everything right, which is, it's kind of impressive itself. But to be honest, he's not worthy of a lot of the grandiose language that we used to describe Shackleton's Voyage. And I would say I agreed with that up until the very last page of this book, where I started off having a good respect for Shackleton and what he did because I had read the story before. I was very familiar with, a lot of the Age of Exploration kind of things. And then I read the book and started thinking, oh, okay, this is good. I can see what Shackleton's trying to do here in this situation to keep people moving forward. And then you get to the end of the book, and then everything, the gravity of what had just happened just comes crashing down, where you realize they really did this. And this is really, really impressive. And for those people who don't really understand why this story has so much weight, like here in my notes, I mentioned that this, to me, has kind of the flavor of classic movies. For instance, I have personally taken a lot of people to see very classic movies like Casablanca, The Treasure of Sierra Madre, Citizen Kane, even some slightly more modern ones like Lawrence of Arabia, Das Boot, right? And I can't tell you how many people I have taken to see these movies or watch these movies with, and they are just like, meh. There's no emotional attachment to seeing, what a lot of people think are these great films. Now, I'm certainly no film critic myself, but in our modern world, we see a lot of movies and we consume a lot of content, right? And when you watch Citizen Kane after seeing a lot of more modern movies, you think, okay, this movie is really boring and there's nothing to this. This is nothing special. It's only afterwards do you have to explain to people, no. This movie is special because this is the first time this was done in film, right? Casablanca, same way. A lot of people may see that and say, oh, well, this is not really that impressive. But it's only when you explain to them, oh, no, this is the first time in film where we see the ending be a double bluff, right? That people sort of understand, oh, okay, that's why this movie's famous, right? It's the same thing with Shackleton's story. Like, they see what Shackleton did and they say, oh, this isn't that impressive, until they realize, hey, this is really the first time that a commander has done these things. Shackleton knew, even though it was standard at the time for leadership to originate at the end of a pistol, Shackleton knew that was no use, and he had to shift a lot of the cultural expectations of the time to get stuff done. I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, at least 5 people during this voyage would have been shot by any other commander for their insubordination. But Shackleton was able to not just take that insubordination and basically traces of mutiny and turn that into something productive, but he was also able to not let that infect the other crew. And that is just something that is really, really hard to convey how he did that. And I'm still in mystery in some regards of how he did that. This is why I think, many of the leadership lessons found in, military courses or in military schools and stuff like that, it comes from this idea, right? It comes from this situation. Shackleton being furious that the cook had set choice cuts of meat aside for him, and the fact that the cook had tried to make his food better than the rest of the crew, and Shackleton being furious at that is a complete and utter oddity for the time period, because it was expected that the captain of the ship, the officers of the ship, get better food than the crew. But once they were stranded, the whole situation took a whole different path, right? Shackleton and his officers ate the same thing as everybody else because they were in a survival situation, which I honestly don't think would have happened with anyone else but Shackleton, which is, again, pointing to why this story is so interesting. So to sort of wrap things up and keep things in our modern perspective, right? I think that looking at age-old, century-old stories of survival from the age of Antarctic exploration, it may not seem like it has a whole lot of bearing on today's life. Like, I did not really go into this thinking that this would be anything more than an entertaining read that we might be able to cherry pick some lessons from. And that's kind of what we did, but to be honest, we're coming into 2024, and I don't think that anyone on Earth thinks this year is going to be easy by any stretch of the imagination. And it's really good to, on the one hand, look back in time and realize how timeless a lot of the issues that we're going to have are, and also how unremarkable some of these people are. It turns out, even though, Shackleton himself may be put up on a pedestal a lot of times, it turns out that entirely unremarkable men did some very remarkable things. And in the end, it turns out that completely ordinary men were not ordinary by any stretch of the imagination. I think that gives a lot of hope for us moving into what we know is going to be a very stressful and difficult time, that we always have the chance to do better. And we always have the chance to buck up and do the right thing, especially in times of hardship. Looking back in time to seemingly unrelated stories of survival and hardship really gives us the chance to realize that we have a lot more power in ourselves than we think we do, and we can absolutely tackle any problem that we set our mind to. In an age of hopelessness, stories like this can help us make perseverance a trend. And that is why I really enjoyed reading this book. I myself am never going to get stranded on an ice floe in Antarctica, but I will most certainly be facing a lot of the personality issues, the morale problems, and just the utter stress of living in the near future. And I'm betting that a lot of you will be going through the same thing, if you aren't already. So it's really good to see that even 100 years ago, a lot of the personality issues that we're running through, the stress of working with the community in a time of hardship, these problems are not new. And it's really good to know that it is possible to go forward and do good things, even if it seems like all hope is lost. So I think there is no better way than to start off 2024 with an air of hope. Hope that we can change things for the better, and if that's not possible, then maybe we can have the hope that we can all endure together, whatever the future might bring. So thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.